We tell children that family is sacred, that blood is thicker than water, that you should love your parents no matter what. And then we send those exact same children into therapy at 25 because the people they trusted the most broke something inside them. It is the greatest contradiction in modern life, and nobody talks about it. Most people don't hate their parents with the kind of hate that burns buildings down. That's not what this is. This is the quiet kind, the kind that wakes you up at 2 a.m. and sits on your chest. The realization doesn't arrive in a single dramatic moment. It builds, slowly, over years. One lie, one broken promise, one carefully disguised manipulation at a time. And by the time you finally put words to it, you've already been carrying it for so long that naming it feels like ripping off a bandage that's fused to your skin. But here's the thing. You aren't supposed to feel this way. At least, that's what the world tells you. From the time you are born, you are placed inside a script that was written long before you existed. Be grateful. They kept you alive. They fed you. They put a roof over your head. And if they did those things, you owe them your love, your obedience, and your forgiveness. Forever, no matter what. But that script wasn't written for you. It was written by people who couldn't imagine a world where the people who raised you were also the people who damaged you. The problem is that the people who wrote the script never had to live in it. In 1998, a developmental psychologist named Dr. Judy Lewis at the University of Washington started studying something she called dysfunctional loyalty. She spent 15 years tracking a group of adults who had emotionally distant, controlling, or narcissistic parents. The participants weren't abused in the way that makes headlines. They weren't locked in closets. They were fed. They were educated. But they were systematically denied the one thing a child actually needs to survive, the ability to have their own feelings. Every emotion was managed. Every reaction was corrected. Every boundary was treated like an act of war. And what Lewis found was staggering. The psychological damage didn't look like trauma in the traditional sense. It looked like a slow, suffocating erosion of the self. The participants didn't walk around hating their parents. They walked around hating themselves. They felt guilty for wanting to leave. They felt ashamed for wanting to be left alone. They spent their entire adult lives trying to earn the approval of people who had never once made them feel seen. And the worst part, they didn't even know it was happening, because the manipulation was dressed up as love. You see it everywhere if you know what to look for. The mother who calls every day but fills the conversation with subtle jabs about your weight, your career, your partner. The father who pays for everything but holds it over your head like a weapon every time you disagree with him. The parents who show up to every event but use the car ride home to tell you everything you did wrong. None of it looks like cruelty from the outside. It looks like involvement. It looks like caring. But from the inside, from the perspective of the child who has to live inside that reality, it is a cage built out of affection. And you can't complain about a cage that looks like a living room. And here's where the science gets heavy. In 2014, a team of neuroscientists at Harvard used fMRI machines to scan the brains of adults who had experienced chronic emotional invalidation as children. What they found was that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for self-identity, decision-making, and long-term planning, was significantly underdeveloped compared to the control group, literally smaller. These weren't people who were weak. These were people whose brains had spent 20 years being told that their thoughts didn't matter. So their brains adapted. They stopped forming their own thoughts. The part of them that should have been saying, "I am a separate person from you," simply didn't grow. They couldn't set boundaries. They couldn't identify their own desires. They couldn't even tell you what they liked for dinner without a 30-second pause, because every preference had been overridden so many times that they no longer trusted their own judgment. You feel that, even if you've never had a brain scan. You feel it when you go home for the holidays. You feel it when your mother asks why you're not eating, and you say you're full, even though you haven't taken a single bite. You feel it when your father makes a comment about your life choices, and instead of defending yourself, you just laugh. You swallow the words. You compress yourself. You perform. And the terrible part is that you've gotten so good at performing that you've convinced yourself you're fine. You tell yourself it's just how they are. You tell yourself they didn't mean it. You tell yourself that if you could just be a better child, a more successful child, a more compliant child, they would finally see you, but they won't, because the script they are reading from is not about you. It was never about you. It was about their own unresolved trauma, their own fear, their own need to control the one thing in their life that they thought they could control completely. And when you were born, you became the character in their play. If you stayed in your lane, you were loved. If you stepped out of it, you were punished. Not with violence, with coldness, with silence, with the slow, deliberate withdrawal of affection that is far more effective than a slap. This is why the realization feels so violent when it finally hits. Because the script you were handed as a child promised you a simple equation. Good behavior equals love. And you played by the rules for 20 years. You got the grades. You called when you were supposed to call. You smiled when you were supposed to smile. And then, one day, you looked in the mirror and realized that the person staring back at you was a stranger. You had no idea what you actually liked. You had no idea what you actually wanted. You had spent so many years contorting yourself into the shape your parents needed you to be, that the original you had simply dissolved. The hatred you feel isn't for them. It's for the years you lost. It's for the version of you that you never got to become. It's for the person you would have been if someone had just once, in the entire history of your childhood, told you that your feelings mattered. And most people never talk about this, because the second you say it out loud, the world rushes in to defend the parents. But they did their best. But they had a hard childhood too. But you only have one mother. And yes, all of that is true. They probably did do their best. They probably suffered in ways you'll never fully understand. But doing your best and not causing harm are two completely different things. A surgeon who tries their best but operates on the wrong leg is still a problem. The intentions of the person holding the knife don't undo the damage to the body. And the love that comes wrapped in control is not love. It is a transaction. It is a contract you were never given the chance to read before you signed it. So what do you do with this? You don't get to erase them. You don't get to pretend the realization didn't happen. And you definitely don't owe them the version of you that they built in their head. What you can do is stop performing. You can allow yourself to feel the anger without letting it consume you. You can sit with the grief of the parents you should have had. You can let yourself be furious that you had to figure out your own worth on your own, in your 20s, in a therapist's office. You can feel all of it, the rage, the sadness, the bone-deep exhaustion of pretending for 2 decades. And then, when you are ready, you can do the hardest thing you will ever do. You can forgive them. Not for their sake, for yours. Not because they deserve it, but because the alternative is dragging their damage around inside your body like a second skeleton for the rest of your life. Because the moment you stop contorting yourself to fit someone else's shape is the moment you finally take up space. You stop shrinking when they walk into the room. You stop rehearsing your sentences before you call. You stop feeling your stomach drop every time your phone buzzes. You start making decisions based on what you want, not on what would make them stop being disappointed. You start building a life that is so undeniably yours that their approval becomes irrelevant. Not because you hate them, but because you finally love yourself enough to stop asking for permission to exist. And for the first time in your life, you won't be performing love. You'll actually be free to feel it, to give it, to receive it, to let other people in without immediately calculating the cost. You will become the parent you needed, the friend you craved, the partner who actually sees you. And when you look back at the person you were at 15, contorting yourself in a living room that never felt safe, you won't feel hatred. You will feel grief. And then, slowly, you will feel pride, because you got out. You broke the cycle, and you did it without a map. That is what freedom actually looks like. Not revenge, not estrangement, just a quiet room, a phone that doesn't ring with guilt, and a version of yourself that finally gets to exist.